start with prayer tonight. In the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God, all gracious and loving, we ask you to open our hearts that we might know in the depths of our being your voice that speaks continuously, calling us to yourself. May we respond, Lord, with great love and energy to that call through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, so the last 2 weeks in a row, we did sort of an overview of Catholicism, kind of an introduction. And so if you picked up one of the outlines, you could see kind of a summary of that. And we looked first at our Catholic vision, how we see things in a universal way. The first week. The second week, we focused a bit on the history of how Christianity got to where it is today, so you have a sense of the historical background. And very briefly at the end last week, I also talked about some of the things that are uniquely Catholic, some of those qualities that set us apart from other Christians. So any questions about that before we go on to tonight's topic? Leftover questions. Okay. All right, so our next topic tonight has to do with what it means to be human. And so all of us are experts in this field because we're all humans. And all of us have an experience of being human. And tonight we're going to be looking at the question of what it means to be human and some of the great questions that emerge when we reflect upon ourselves. And we're going to be looking at the ways our culture today understands or answers those questions. But we're also going to look at the Catholic Christian viewpoint on that. So I want to start by just mentioning that if you stop and think about it very long, being human is a wonderful, terrible mystery. That's one of the ways I like to define it. It's a wonderful, terrible mystery. There are things about being human that are absolutely wonderful, and we have moments in our life when we wake up and we walk out the door and we see the sunrise and we stop for a moment and we think, wow, you know, this is a perfect day. And our bodies feel wonderful. We're not afflicted by any negative emotions at that moment. And in that moment we think, wow, it's great to be alive. It's great to be human. Hopefully all of us have had those moments. So that's the wonderful dimension of being human. I also say it's a terrible thing because not every moment in human life is like that. And there are some agonizing moments in the human journey. And if you live long enough, you experience those agonies of being human in lots of different ways. The unexplained sufferings of life that come our way. The things that happen that we wish would not happen. Reflecting upon ourselves and our own human weaknesses and our limitations and our failures. So, but at the bottom of it, being human is a bit of a mystery, isn't it? Someone said, you know, think about the person that you know best in the world. And is not that person, though you know them very well, isn't that person still, in a sense, a mystery? And once in a while, you think, wow, this person is still a mystery. And if you think about it even further, isn't that true about ourselves? As soon as we think, I am still a mystery to myself. You know, I don't know myself fully. One of the greatest Christians of the first 1,000 years was a man whose feast day we recently celebrated by the name of Augustine. He became one of the greatest saints in the history of the Catholic Church. And Augustine had a robust experience growing up. His mother was a Christian. She was a Catholic Christian, and her faith she took seriously. His father was a pagan, a non-believer. And Augustine was raised by his mother as a Catholic Christian, but when he went off to do his studies, he wanted to leave all of that behind. And And what he did when he got to his studies was, he was a true explorer of the human condition. He began to search the philosophies of the world to try to find meaning and purpose in life. Not only did he explore the philosophies of the world, but he also began to experiment with human relationships. He eventually had a child out of wedlock, whom he named Deodatus, gift of God. And yet, during that whole period in his restless wanderings, his mother, Monica, was praying that God would touch his heart and bring Augustine to himself. Augustine had a very long journey to get to that point. And at first his mother took what I would call the punitive parental approach. If you're gonna not act this way, then you're not welcome to come home and have dinner and be under our roof anymore. But she was assured by someone, you have to love him and God will do his work. So she began to love him and to treat him with great tenderness, as she always had. But perhaps she was a little bit too much of a smothering mother at one moment. So Augustine went down to the shipyard. He told his mother he was going to be seeing a friend off at the shipyard, but he himself jumped on the ship and left North Africa and his mother behind. So he went to Italy. He wanted to get away from the protective care of his mother, and he arrived in the port, I think, of Rome. Is that right, Father?
I'm not sure, actually.
Okay, which port it was. And his mother, by the way, was heartbroken when she found out he left without him. So she hopped on a ship to follow him. By the time she caught up with him, he had arrived in the great city of Milan. And there, the bishop at the time, Ambrose, one of the great proclaimers of the Christian faith, was preaching in the cathedral. Ambrose, by the way, had his own great story because he was a governor in Milan, and when the bishop died, they had to have an election to elect the new bishop, and the people and the clergy gathered in the cathedral church, and Ambrose had not been baptized. In those days, they were afraid to be baptized too early, lest they commit grave sins, and they would wait sometimes till later in life to be baptized as adults. So Ambrose had never been baptized, but he was the governor, and so he wanted to ensure good civic order, so he was at the church for the election of the new bishop. And during the course of that election, one of the children began to yell, "Ambrose for bishop." And the crowd resoundingly took up the cry, and I think there was some kind of a sign with a bird. And he was, in fact, elected the Bishop of Milan. And in those days, the Bishop of Milan had more impact even than the Bishop of Rome in the local area of politics. So it was quite an important episcopal see in those days. And Ambrose was baptized, confirmed, received First Communion, and ordained all within like a week, and became the Bishop of Milan. He became one of the greatest bishops in the early church, a doctor of the church, and he was given the name the Honey-Tongued because he proclaimed the gospel so powerfully it moved hearts. Well, one of the people who was listening was Augustine in the pews, and his mother's faith, which was very personal, he heard articulated by Ambrose in a way that also met the intellectual demands of his mind. And it was there that he was converted himself personally to the faith. And he actually heard children playing what sounded like a game, take and read, and he picked up the scriptures and was transformed by reading a scripture and thus accepted the Christian faith. But Augustine would impact Christianity from that point onward, and he wrote a couple of very significant works. We have a lot of his homilies left behind. One of them, The City of God, not the homily, but one of his great works has to do with how we live as Christians in the middle of this transitional world when it seems so coming apart in light of the eternal city that is God's. And the second one that has been profoundly impactful on the history of Christianity is his Confessions. Now, when we hear the word confessions, we think, oh, he was confessing his sins. He was really confessing his faith in God. So it's his personal journey, as it were. And on his feast day, He reflected, we have a little snippet from the Confessions. And Augustine had this experience inside of himself. And the experience was what I will describe as he had an infinite hunger, an infinite thirst, a desire and a yearning inside of himself that he was trying to fill. And he looked everywhere and all the creative things around him to try to find something to fill that yearning. And perhaps that's why he looked at so many different philosophies and falling in love and having a child. What was he really looking for? And if one thinks about it, that's another good definition of what it means to be human, isn't it? We have these yearnings in our heart. We discover in our heart yearnings, longings, desires, and we know that we're created for certain things more than for other things. When we walk outside and we see a beautiful mountain range or an ocean and we see true beauty for the first time. How many of y'all remember seeing the ocean for the first time in your life? Or a mountain range? And you thought, this is beautiful. There's something inside the human person that's created for such beauty. So we're drawn to it. And one evening I was invited to a parishioner's home for dinner several years ago. And they had this dessert that I had never had before. And it was an ice cream, it was chocolate. And I tasted it and I thought, this is the best chocolate ice cream I have ever tasted in my life. And so I said, what is this? It was chocolate Trinity ice cream from Publix. So it's the Publix brand, so they still have full half gallons, by the way. So, and so, you know, for that moment, I thought, tasting that chocolate Trinity ice cream, I thought, this is the best ice cream I've ever tasted, it's chocolate. You know, it was like, this is exactly what I've been looking for, you know, for the moment, you know, it's not. But after a while, of course, what happens? You know, you've had a bowl of chocolate Trinity, and, you know, this, if you get a second bowl, it's not going to taste as good as the first bowl, right? The same is true, by the way, of any human experience that we have. We keep bumping into things that fill the human soul, but they don't fill it completely. They leave an interior longing for something more. That's the way we're created. And even if you think about the best moment of your life, let's say you have fallen in love and you're with that person that you love, and you have the most beautiful moment that you've ever had with that person in the most beautiful place of all. What's the problem with such fulfillment? It ends, exactly. It doesn't last forever. And what we bump into is we bump into what I will call the boundary of our earthly life, our finitude, our limitation. And so every single thing that fulfills the human heart is not endless. And the great leveler of all that is death itself. The people that we love the most, when we lose them, it's a profound moment in life because we know that this is not the way I want to live forever, losing that which matters most to me. So that's the inner contradiction of being human. That's why it's a wonderful, terrible mystery that we are. Because we have this infinite desire, but nothing that we see around us in this creation, in the end, can fulfill it forever. That's the limitation. And that restlessness was what Augustine was bumping into. And he makes the observation that his heart was restless until it rested in God. And I want to share a little quote from his Confessions. Augustine says this, "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside. And it was there that I searched for you. In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created." You see, I'm looking desperately to fulfill that. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you, yet if they had not been in you, they would not have been at all. And listen to how he uses all the senses. You called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for more. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and thirst for more. You touched me, and I burned for your peace. Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You are within me. So Augustine discovered in his longings that he was made for something more than that which is around us in this created world. He was made for God himself. And God was already dwelling within. Augustine didn't know it, that's why he was plunging himself into the lovely things God had created. All right, so with that awareness of that terrible, wonderful mystery that we are, that interior longing, that desire that we've all been given. Another way of putting it is, who's the singer who sings, "Everybody's got a hungry heart"? Bruce Springsteen? Yeah. So, I mean, that's an Augustinian thought in 20th century rock. Everybody's got a hungry heart, and got a hole in our heart. The only problem is that in 20th century pop music, it's always another human being we're going to fall in love, and that's going to fulfill that place. Except, ... it's only temporary. So I always say too that the other great element about being human is, and partly because of this terrible, wonderful mystery that we are, and this yearning inside of us, and this limited life that we're living, is we are able to ask what I like to call the great questions. Questions of the most ultimate importance. And we all have to answer those questions, and we answer them not simply by what we think about, but the way we live our life is an answer to those great questions. I've written some of those great questions up on the board. So, number one, where did we come from? And what's our origin? Everybody wants to know where we came from ultimately. That's why, for example, I think home matters to people. What was your home? What was your hometown? Where do you come from? Unless home was a conflicted place, then home might have multiple meanings associated with it. Another great question, where are we going? What's our destiny? Where are we headed? We all want to answer that great question. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Another question, what's wrong with us? And you might ask yourself, what do you mean, what's wrong with you? And my typical answer is, all you have to do is turn on the morning news to know there's something wrong with human beings. When you get up in the morning in Nashville, how many shootings took place overnight right here in the city of Nashville? And then as you watch the news around the world, it's quite clear that something is wrong with we human beings. But I also have to add immediately, we don't need newspapers to tell us that, do we? If we're completely honest with ourselves, if we look at our own self without looking at anyone else, it's quite clear that there's something wrong with us at times. The good that we would want to do, we don't do. Why? Why do we do things that are self-centered and destructive and that harm our relationships with the people that matter the most? Why do we harm ourselves in the process? So what's wrong with us that we act in such destructive and non-life-giving kinds of ways? That's a core question. And then when you ask that question, you immediately want to know, well, how am I going to solve that problem? What's the solution to what's wrong with me? And then, another great question, why are we here to begin with? What's our purpose? What are we doing here? What are we here for? Those are the great questions that I think we human beings are given the privilege of asking and also of living an answer to throughout our whole life. And when you stop and think about it, we're in the visible creation, we're the only creatures that ask these big questions. Your dog doesn't get up in the morning and say, gee, why am I here today? What's my purpose in life? Where am I going? What's wrong with me? Or at least if they're asking those kinds of questions, they're not telling us about it, right? So what are the answers that our culture is giving us today? Let's look at the question, where do we come from? So if we were to look out at the world around us in 21st century America and ask the question, where do we human beings come from ultimately? What's the number one scientific answer today, by the way? That's gleaned the most consensus in the scientific community. All right, we evolved from apes. Actually, if you follow evolutionary biologists, I was a biology major at first in college, we evolved, all the way back to the most simple forms of human or of cellular life on Earth. So evolution is the number one answer, but you push evolution. I can't remember how many humanoid type figures on the planet, what, about 100,000 years, something like that. How long has life been on the planet? I can't remember how many millions of years it is, but the planet is older than life. So planet Earth is what, 4 to 6 billion years old. So even if you say there were simple forms of life on the planet that slowly evolved and became more complex and diversified, before that, what was there? And how old is the universe itself? Common scientific answer today, around 12 to 15 billion years old. So a universe that's been around from 12 to 15 billion years old, and with the newest telescopes like the Hubble telescope, you go further and further back into the origins of the universe because it takes a while for light to travel, so you can see further and further back into time. And so the theory is that at one moment there was an emanation, what scientists and those popularized writers call the Big Bang. So everything emanated outward at one point, a point of beginning. Scientists can trace back pretty far to those very early milliseconds, the kinds of things that were going on as the universe expanded rapidly, and stars and galaxies were formed, and so where are we going, by the way, another question. So you could say evolution and the Big Bang for where we came from. Where are we going? Well, individually, we're all going to end up where? Death, right? So nobody gets out of here alive. That's the bad news, right? So I do have to tell you a strange story. I was walking in the parking lot during the International Festival, and I told this fellow I've never met before, I said, well, I don't know what the future holds. I was going to say, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future, which is God. But I only got the words, I don't know what the future holds. When he got the words out, I do. And I was like, oh. And then he started to tell me, there's going to be, it sounded like the book of Revelation, apocalyptic literature, and billions of people are going to die. So I was thinking about his comment, and I thought, well, of course, billions of people are going to die. We're all going to die someday. Nobody was alive on planet Earth today. In about 200 years is going to be on this planet. So, yes, he's correct. Now, the timing may be a bit different from his scenario, but we're all going to face death itself. And even the entire universe that we're in, the human lifespan might be 100 years or 120 something at the oldest these days. But, the universe itself had a starting point, and at some point, it's going to have an end point, a completion, as it were. And so what happens beyond the boundary of death? That's the great question that occupies a lot of human beings. So what are the typical answers we'll get out in the culture today? What are the alternatives?
After death?
What's that?
So you said after death?
Yeah, what happens after death?
What, like heaven or hell?
Or at heaven or hell? All right, that's a Christian answer, and it's certainly alive and well in our culture. What other answers are out there in our culture? Yeah.
Some say nothing.
Some say nothing, yeah. So if you're an atheist, for example, you don't believe in anything beyond this physical creation, death is the end point. So once you die, that's it. You're done, you're finished. Or if you're an agnostic, you don't know if there's a spiritual reality beyond this visible world. You don't know if there's anything beyond death. So it's a big question mark. I heard a story about someone who was in a hospital, and they were, patients could say what religion they were, and somebody had checked agnostic, and they were like, "What's an agnostic?" And someone said, "Oh, that's someone who doesn't know whether there's God or not." That person said, "Well, this patient's like 75, maybe they should be making a decision by now." So it's a question about, do we believe in God? Do we believe there's anything beyond the boundary of death? And there are many people in our culture today who don't believe that there's anything beyond death. If you believe that, it will shape the way you live life in a lot of different ways, don't you think? Now, there's also one other great alternative that's become popular in Western culture.
Reincarnation.
Exactly, reincarnation. I will mention, by the way, that one ancient religion, Hinduism, believes in reincarnation, an endless cycle of births and rebirths. But in that understanding of the ancient Hindu idea, you can advance to greater forms of life or to lesser forms of life depending upon how you live. So if you live really well as a caterpillar, a perfect caterpillar existence, then when you get reincarnated, you might end up being, a farmer or something, but if you're a farmer and you don't live your existence very well, you might be an earthworm next time you return. So you go up and down the scale of existence, and this endless cycle of rebirths. But at some point, even the Hindus believe there is moksha, a liberation from that endless cycle of rebirths. And so the idea has been imported into Western culture, and so some people believe that they lived previous human lives. Most of those people believe that they've only been human and that things always get better. So it's a different version of reincarnation. My good friend Father Joe McMahon says when somebody was talking to him about reincarnation, he said, "Don't you think once is enough?" And that too makes a difference. If you think you've got an endless cycle of lives to go through to get things right versus thinking, "This is my one shot at living life," you might live life very differently, depending upon what is framing your world of thought. All right, what's wrong with us? Contemporary answers in our culture. Why do human beings do things destructively? What's one of the common answers?
The mental health issue.
Or a mental health issue. And so, if you believe that that's the key problem, and by the way, mental health as an understanding of how we human beings are miswired is relatively recent development in human history, since the 1800s, let's say. So an awareness that human beings are affected. And usually if you have mental illness, most psychologists today will trace that to one of two origins. Either genetics or early life environment. That is the great debate in our 20th century, the schools of psychology. What shapes a child more? Is it their genetics, or is it the environment that they're raised in? If you want to see a film that is utterly fascinating, that explores that question, it's one of the questions it explores. It just came out of the Belcourt, I don't know if it's still there, but you can certainly probably stream it now. 3 Identical Strangers. So there was a scientific study done back in the early 1960s, and a mother gave birth to 3 sons, identical triplets. They were separated at birth and put into 3 different families. It was kind of a social experiment. They put one in a workers' family, one in a middle-class family, one in an upper echelon family, yeah, it's pretty horrific what happens. And so they're trying to figure out, is it the genetics that affect the life, or is it the early environment? That's a question that they were, I suspect, trying to answer in doing things like that. It's a powerful film, by the way. They discovered each other in college. So one of them showed up on campus, and everybody started hugging him, greeting him, and calling him by someone else's name. And he goes, "I'm not so-and-so." "Yeah, it's great to see you back." He was like, "I'm not back. This is my first day." And this guy says, "No, you got to meet my friend from last year. You've got to be, identical twins." And they called the guy, and the two of them meet. They did this big news story in the paper, and then the third one saw the story and saw them on the front page of the newspaper, and it was his own face he saw there. So that's the three got together. It's a fascinating narrative. So, and they tease you all the way through the film. What shaped these men more? Was it their genetic background, or was it the environments that they were raised in? But if there's mental illness is the issue, and you think it's environment, what's the solution? You're going to have to work for a different social situation, right? You have to change the social circumstances. If it's genetic, there's not much you can do, except for the new areas of epigenetic development that they've been developing. And by the way, they've discovered now that early life environments can also shape the genes of a person, epigenetic changes. So it's fascinating. Those things can be inherited, those traits can be inherited. Another classic answer, by the way, for what's wrong with us was a Greek philosophical answer from Socrates, the Socratic school, and that was that we do things that are destructive because of a lack of knowledge. So we don't know what's truly good for us. And what would be the answer if the lack of knowledge is the problem? Education, yes. Good schools. Yeah, and that Greek philosophical thought has shaped us, right? That's why we have educational systems, and we put emphasis upon educating children well, all that sort of thing. You teach them to live well, and they will live well. So these are some of the common cultural answers given to the question, what's wrong with us? Mental health, either from genetics or early life environment, or a lack of knowledge about what is good and true, and therefore the solutions depend upon what you believe the problem is. And last but not least, why are we here? What's our purpose in being here? What's one of the more common answers you'll hear today on the streets of America? Or to help others, that's a very defined purpose. One common school of thought that's been very popular in the 20th century and early 21st century is a school of thought called existentialism, and their answer was, every person gets to decide why you're here. It's an individual thing, so you create your answer to that question of why you're here and what your purpose in life is. So sort of an individually defined answer. By the way, if you ever teach high school students morality, they're all existentialists. Because you ask the question, you can't tell me what to do or what's right and wrong, I get to decide that, so there's a lot of, we all carry a bit of that with our individualism that affects and shapes the way we think about life. All right, so in light of that, if we back up a bit from our current cultural answers to these questions and ask, what is the Catholic Christian vision about these great questions? You may be surprised a bit. So first with the question, where did we come from? What's our origin? The answer from our perspective will not be as simple, the modern world is wrong, but as I said last week, one unique thing about being Catholic is we are both and people. So both reason and faith inform our answers to great questions. So we can say insofar as science answers questions about the human condition or the origins of the universe. We can certainly accept any knowledge or facts or truth that comes from any field of human endeavor and learning. So there is actually a lot of scientific evidence to support the story of the creation of the universe 12 to 15 billion years ago and how life evolved over time on planet Earth. In fact, when you look at the DNA in a human being and the DNA in any other living thing on the planet, they're actually quite close. They share a lot of genes. And I'm saying this a little facetiously, but go to a zoo and look at the animals. We'll pay attention to how, especially, things like apes move around and look at you. It's not hard to imagine that there is some link that we human beings share with all of these other living beings that we're with. So what the Catholic Church will say, though, is that we go beyond the answers that science is able to give. And what do I mean by that? Well, science can explain, perhaps, how things unfold over time in this creation, but they can't answer more fundamental questions like, why is there something here at all, rather than nothing? And they can't push us beyond that moment, what we call the Big Bang. So where did all that come from? This whole universe that's unfolded with great beauty and order. And the answer from a Catholic point of view is it has its origins in a loving creator. When you read the book of Genesis, it describes this tohe wabohu, this mess. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Isn't it interesting that the very first thing God creates is light? And even scientific theories, when they talk about the Big Bang, it's an emanation of energy, matter, and time all at once. In fact, in some mysterious way, the great story of Genesis almost, in fact, does kind of unfold how the universe unfolds over time. It begins with light, or energy, and time, and matter all coming to be. It's kind of fascinating that Hebrew poetry from, 500, 1,000 years before Jesus, in such a beautiful narrative form, captures something quite profound. So we believe that everything that exists comes from the loving intent of a creator, a God who creates and sustains all creation. So I always like to say that if you read the first chapter of Genesis literally, that God created the universe in 7 24-hour days like we experience on planet Earth today, there's a certain majesty about it, no doubt. But the idea that this creator God has unfolded this immense creation far beyond our understanding for 12 to 15 billion years shows me a God who is far more infinite than any of us could ever hope to dare or dream or imagine. So the both and answer, we reject nothing that is true, that science discovers in the course of its meanderings, but we see beyond that to a deeper level. The question about where are we going? What's our destiny? And the answer to that is we are on our way to something more. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I want to skip that question for just a second. What's wrong with us? Would the church deny any of the answers I put on the board? Sometimes do we do things wrong because we don't know the right course of action? Are we affected by our environment and our genes? Absolutely. Those things profoundly impact a human being. You only have to, I'm great for films, but what's that film that came out? Moonlight, did you see that film? That was a horrible film to watch. But this kid grows up in an environment that's destructive and drug addicted. Well, he becomes just like he grew up in. But there is grace in the film. But still, you see how much the environment that a person grows up in shapes that destiny of the human person. So we, as Catholics, deny none of that. So we would definitely say, insofar as we have the capability to educate people, we should do so. Insofar as we have the opportunity to create better environments for human beings to grow up in. We're committed and dedicated to doing that. If there are mental health issues that need addressed with professional counseling and therapy, by all means. But, again, this is the both and approaches to us Catholics. There's something deeper that's wrong with us. And we use the word sin to describe that mystery. And sin both in what we call an original form and also in a personal form. And let me say for a moment, original sin. So something at the very beginning of human history, when God endowed human persons with the gift of freedom, we had the opportunity to say yes to God, to choose to love, to be like God in a servant role, as stewards of creation. Or we could reject God's plan or will for us. And the original turning from God's plan for us, His will for us, that original leaving the path that God had marked out for us, is what we mean by the original sin. And the effect it had on all human beings is a ripple effect. So all human beings have thus been affected by that original turning. And you see the narrative in Genesis is very powerful. So what happens? You have the woman and the man in the garden, and the woman is tempted. All the man is right there with her, and they eat from the fruit from which they were forbidden to eat, which is the knowledge of good and evil. You can only have knowledge of evil, by the way, if you've tasted it. So they taste evil, and in the course of tasting evil, they know the difference between goodness and evil, but it's not a good kind of knowing. And so you see the ripple effects of that first turning from God's plan for them. I was driving in my car one day, and I was going home to Lawrenceburg, and I had a baseball for my nephew. And I was going around a curve, and the baseball went off the seat beside me and started rolling around in the floorboard. And I thought, that's going to drive me crazy rolling around my floorboard. So I reached over to grab it to pick it back up, which was foolish, because when I did that, my car left the road and I went into the ditch. And so the car started shaking. It terrified me. I didn't damage myself or anything, thankfully. Got back on the road and decided that was not a prudent course of action. But what that taught me was that when you're driving your car on the road that it was made to drive on, it works pretty well. But when you don't drive your car on the road that it was created for, it's very destructive. So you know, you can look at human beings, when we're living as we're created to live, things work pretty well. But that original turning, what happens is they immediately feel separated from God. Shame and guilt cover them. They hide from God in the garden. So it affects their connection with their Creator profoundly. The second thing it does is it ripples out to destroy relationships with each other. So the man blames the woman. It's the woman you put here. It was her fault. And then she blames the creature. You know, it was its fault, you know. So this blaming thing. And then even their relationship with creation itself flows into a destructive pattern. Now work is going to be hard. Childbearing is going to be difficult. So we're not at home with ourselves, with each other, with God, or this creation God put us in. And the ripple effects of that turning from God began to ripple out to affect all human beings and their relationships with each other. So even though we're born into a good world that God created, we're also born into a world that has been affected radically by the presence of the effects of that original sin. So we don't grow up unwounded by that original wounding to humanity. Not only that, so that's original sin, but each human person, every time we turn aside from the path that God marks out for us, we add our own distortion to God's creation. We create our own dark energy. And it's like throwing a pebble into the lake and the ripples go out and they touch everything. So when I am distrustful and I accuse somebody that I love of doing something they didn't do, then they become grouchy and irritable toward the children, and then the children kick the dog. You've seen the cartoons, right? So the ripple effects of what we do also affect each other. So sin is the deepest wounding to the human person and the deepest problem. So that means, by the way, if there's something deeper than mental illness, deeper than our environment or our genes or lack of knowledge, that the solution also has to be deeper. It can't, those things alone, education, proper health, mental health care, creating good environments, those things alone will not solve the problem of the human person. So what is the deeper solution, the ultimate solution? The deepest solution is Christ. It's the free act of God in liberating humanity from the darkness that we cannot free ourselves from. So through the cross and resurrection of Christ, grace is given by which the human person can be redeemed and set free. There's a word in the Old Testament when a person was sold into slavery, when you're a piece of property, you don't own anything, so you can't buy your way out of slavery. You're trapped. So if you want to get out of being a slave, what's your solution? Somebody's got to come along who has enough money to buy you and set you free. And they had to work for that person, that somebody in the Old Testament, the Goel, the Redeemer, who would redeem you from your slavery. So, but the problem with human beings is, though the woundedness of sin is so great that no human being can heal another human being from that grave wounding apart from God. And thus the mystery of God becoming human in the incarnation and going through his death on the cross for us and rising from the dead and sending the Holy Spirit. Thus, we are set free by the grace given us. So the deepest healing that comes to us is through the grace of God freely given in Christ. Let me also add a quick side note. Because of the death and resurrection of Christ and the work of the Holy Spirit, we don't live simply in a world affected by sin, but we are now living in a world that's been touched and transformed by grace. So every action of love and goodness also ripples out to affect every other human being. Every time I act in a noble, honest, life-giving, and loving fashion toward my fellow human beings, and with my true dignity as a human being, it spills out light to every other human being. So I become a channel or an instrument through which God's infinite light can work. So yes, we do live in a good creation that God created. Yes, we do live in a broken world, but we also live in a graced universe, touched by the grace, the active grace of God working on our behalf. That's why Paul will come to this understanding that God can work through anything in our life to bring about good. That's the great mystery. We go through the darkest moments and come to the fundamental core conviction of faith that God is still at work in it. We are not left alone. And I had a very personal, profound experience about my 30-day retreat when we're asked to look back over our whole life. And I had this one awareness, and I said, where were you? I'm asking God in my prayer, where were you when that happened? And the reply of God to me and my prayer was, I protected your soul. So I can look back now and see that even in the darkest moments of life, God never abandons us. He is always there. So that's the reality of the graced world that we live in. So why are we here then? So all the other answers are starting to point us toward a direction, right? To help others is a small part of it. Anybody know what the catechism of the Baltimore Catechism used to say about it? To know God, to love God, and to serve God in this life, so as to live with God forever in the joy of heaven. I'm paraphrasing. But God created us ultimately to live forever in heaven. And Jesus puts it in varied ways, doesn't he? He says, when asked what is the greatest of the commandments, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the two greatest commandments. And in John's Gospel, he will say, as the Father loves me, so also I love you. Live in my love. And you will live in my love if you keep my commandments. And what are my commandments? That you love one another as I love you. So what's the purpose of life? It's to live ultimately for God and God's glory. St. Ignatius of Loyola will have this great thing called the principle and first foundation. And he says, everything in this created world is meant to enable us to make a return of praise and thanks to God, our Creator. And so therefore, anything in creation that helps us to do that is meant to be used for that purpose. But if it becomes a barrier to doing our ultimate purpose of living for God, then it should be surrendered or discarded insofar as we have the freedom to let go of it. So it's an exalted vision, created to live forever with God. And I start that journey here in this world. I don't have to wait until after physical death to start living as God created me to live. And what are signs that I'm living my redeemed life? Well, the fruits of the Holy Spirit. You know, to the extent that I'm governed by peace, by joy, by love, gentleness, prudence, generosity, all of those gifts of the Spirit, that's the sign of a redeemed human life. When you look at the other destructive fruits, you know that I'm not living in my redeemed condition. Self-centeredness, pride, envy, arrogance. Well, just go out and look at the vices on the windows in our narthex, right? You see on one side what redeemed life looks like, and on the other side what the unredeemed life looks like. But you notice even on the vice side of our windows that there's a remedy for each of those vices in all the windows too. You know, God has this sneaky way of being at work almost everywhere we look, even when we don't expect it. So we have a noble purpose in being here. So we don't create our own answer to that question, we discover it. We discover why we're here, and we begin to live in unity with that purpose and meaning, and we discover the joy of living. And I like what Jesus said in John's Gospel. He said, I came that you might have life, and that you might have it abundantly, to the full. So I didn't come so that you could have a little tiny millimeter of life and scrape by in your existence. I came that you might have life in its fullness. I came that you might have my joy, that my joy might be in you, and that your joy might be complete. So in heaven, by the way, one psychologist said we experience 4 core emotions, so everything else kind of flutters off of those. Fear, joy, sadness, anger. You know, almost every complex emotion can be reduced down to those 4 at their core. Well, okay, are those all good emotions in this world that we're living in? Sure. You know, if I see a rattlesnake on the trail and I feel fear, that's protecting me. I step away from it. If I lose someone that matters to me and I'm sad, that's a noble thing that I feel sadness at loss. If I see something unjust happening to someone that shouldn't happen, there's an appropriate anger that happens. And when I experience the goodness of life, I'm filled with joy, right? But what in the end beyond death, which of those 4 will be left in the end? Only joy. So no reason for fear, no reason for anger, no reason for sadness. Only joy. That will be left. And joy includes all the other good emotions, gratitude, love, peace, etc., etc. You know, so that's the purpose for which God created us. And so we as Catholic Christians, where are we going? We believe that God has created us to live forever. And this life is but the preparation for that eternity. This is all about, we are on a journey into eternity. So we're on the edges of a beach that lead us into the infinite ocean of God's love. I will say a lot more about some of the unique things that we believe about that eternity with God. But suffice it to say today that every joy we've ever experienced in this life is but a foretaste of that joy, and that joy will know no limits or boundaries. So the deepest longings and yearnings of the human heart, our restlessness, will finally be fully fulfilled in the face of God. That's what we're created for. And the desire of God is that all of us say yes to that invitation. And we can only be excluded by our own freedom, where we freely turn away from that offer of God and choose rather to live an eternity apart from God and persist in what we call final impenitence to the very end. So we'll say more about the destiny of the human person later in the year, but that's just kind of a prelude, as it were. So this wonderful, terrible mystery of being human. We're the noblest of creatures, and we suffer sometimes in the greatest ways from our own woundedness, and yet we're able to ask such great questions, and we believe that because of the grace of God, that we are able to become who we were created to be. That's the ultimate gift of being human. Or questions about that, or observations? All right, I think there's an opportunity at small tables to talk now. Is that right? Anything you want to say, Janet, before I let them go to the tables? All right, go to your tables and enjoy.